A perfect test, a brilliant mind, and a teacher who ripped it apart not because it was wrong, but because of who got the right answer. Imagine watching your success turn to failure in front of an entire classroom. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. And if you think this can't happen to you, think again. Riverside Middle School was alive with the usual morning chaos, chairs scraping against the linoleum floor, students chatting about last night's game, the latest gossip, the newest viral trend. The early autumn sun filtered through the smudged windows, casting long streaks of golden light across the desks. It was just another day. At the very back of room 3002 near the window, Jamal Carter sat in his usual spot. A 13-year-old black kid, lean, quiet, almost invisible if you weren't looking for him. He wasn't shy, exactly. He just knew how to exist without drawing attention, how to blend in, how to take up as little space as possible. That was a skill you learned early when you looked like him, growing up where he did. His brown eyes drifted outside, watching the leaves tremble in the soft breeze. His posture was relaxed, maybe too relaxed, one arm stretched across the desk, the other propping up his chin. But inside, his mind was moving fast. Numbers danced behind his eyes. Equations formed and solved themselves in the margins of his mind, the way other kids played video games or shot hoops. What no one in this room knew what he made, sure no one knew, was that he was a math genius. A real one. Not the kind that teachers noticed and praised. Not the kind that got invited to gifted programs. No, that wasn't for kids like him. Jamal had learned that a long time ago. So, instead of raising his hand, instead of letting anyone see what he could really do, he kept his head down, kept quiet, kept safe. But today was going to be different. Miss S. Amanda Thompson stood at the front of the classroom, her arms crossed, sharp eyes scanning the room like a drill sergeant inspecting the troops. She was no-nonsense, strict, and had zero patience for slackers. Her blazer was crisp. Her heels clicked against the floor with every step. In her hands was a stack of graded math tests. The tension in the room shifted. Students leaned forward, exchanged nervous glances. Mrs. Thompson didn't just hand back papers, she delivered verdicts. One by one, she called out names, offering quick, blunt feedback. Decent work. You need to study more. This is unacceptable. Then she stopped. Her fingers hesitated over the top paper in the stack. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face: confusion, annoyance, before she schooled her expression back into its usual mask of strict professionalism. She turned her gaze toward the back of the room. Jamal Carter. Jamal blinked, his mind snapping back to the present. A few heads turned toward him, brows raised. Some students smirked, already expecting the usual scolding. He sat up straighter, feeling a sudden heat rise to his face. Miss S. Thompson walked toward him, test paper in hand. A perfect score, 100%, circled in red. She set it on his desk without a word. No praise, no acknowledgement, just a thin, tight-lipped line where her mouth should have been. And then, just when Jamal thought she was going to move on, Carter. Her voice cut through the low murmurs like a knife. Since you did so well on the test, let's see how much you've really been paying attention. Come up here. The room went dead silent. Jamal's stomach twisted. A couple of kids exchanged wide-eyed glances. And then the whispers started. Oh, she's about to cook him. Ain't no way he actually did that test himself. Watch him fold. Jamal swallowed hard. He felt the weight of the stairs, the expectation of failure pressing down on him like a heavy, invisible hand. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood. His legs felt stiff, unnatural, like he was wading through wet cement. Every step toward the front of the room felt longer than the last. Miss S. Thompson picked up a marker and, with sharp, deliberate strokes, wrote an equation on the board. It was complicated, way beyond what the class had covered. She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. Go ahead, Carter. She held out the marker. Show us what you got. Jamal hesitated. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. You don't even know where to start. Watch him just stand there. His fingers curled around the marker. The cool plastic pressed into his palm. For the first time all year, every single eye in that classroom was on him. Jamal took a slow breath and stepped forward. Jamal stood at the front of the room, marker in hand, staring at the equation on the board. It wasn't just difficult, it was a setup. The problem Miss S. Thompson had written was far more advanced than anything they had covered in class. This wasn't just a test of knowledge, it was a trap. A few students stifled laughs behind him. Someone whispered, "He's done for." Jamal felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His fingers tightened around the marker. He had two choices. He could back down, let them believe what they wanted, that he was a fraud, that he had cheated on the test. Or he could show them who he really was. Slowly, he took a deep breath and pressed the marker to the board. The classroom had never been this quiet before. Even the kids who usually didn't care about math were now watching, waiting for him to mess up. Jamal started writing. At first, his movements were slow, cautious, testing the waters. He broke the equation down in his head, isolating variables, simplifying fractions, eliminating unnecessary steps. Then, as the numbers and symbols began to fall into place, his hand grew steadier. His mind worked in a rhythm like a song only he could hear. Step by step, he dismantled the problem. There were no wasted motions, no second guesses. The only sound in the room was the soft squeak of the marker against the board as Jamal moved from one step to the next. The whispers behind him stopped. Students leaned forward, their amusement turning into shock. Wait, is he actually doing it? No way. Even Miss S. Thompson, who had initially stood with her arms crossed, watching with what seemed like smug confidence, now uncrossed her arms. She took a step closer. Jamal's breathing stayed steady. His focus never wavered. And then, after one last calculation, he circled the final answer. Finished. A moment of silence. And then, "What the hell?" someone muttered. The class erupted in murmurs. Jamal finally turned around, his heart pounding. Every pair of eyes in that room was on him. But this time, they weren't looking at him with ridicule. They were looking at him with disbelief. A few students exchanged stunned glances. Some gawked at the board, retracing his steps as if trying to catch a mistake. There was none. Even the kids who had laughed at him weren't laughing anymore. Jamal stood there, gripping the marker, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not pride, power. For the first time, they saw him, really saw him. And then, Miss S. Thompson stepped forward. She studied the board for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to him. And what she said next shattered everything. "Who did you cheat off of?" Jamal blinked. A chill spread through his chest. For a second, he thought he had misheard her. But the way her cold, sharp eyes locked onto his told him otherwise. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't acknowledging what he had just done. She was accusing him. The air in the room shifted. The murmur of voices turned into hushed gasps. Jamal opened his mouth. No words came out. Miss S. Thompson turned back to the board, as if looking for proof of her own suspicion. "This isn't possible," she said, shaking her head. "There's no way you did this on your own." She faced the class, addressing them now, her voice loud and unwavering. Someone must have given him the answer beforehand. Laughter rippled through the room again this time, different. Before, it had been teasing. Now, it was mean. Jamal's stomach clenched. She wasn't just doubting him. She was erasing him. Everything he had just done, every number, every step, every ounce of courage it took to stand in front of the class, was being dismissed. Like it never happened, Jamal finally found his voice. "I didn't cheat." Miss S. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Then prove it." Jamal's hands curled into fists. Prove it? What did she think he just did? But before he could speak again, she reached down, grabbed a piece of paper off her desk, his test, and held it up. She ripped it in half. A gasp rippled through the room. The perfect score. The red 100%. Gone. Torn apart like it meant nothing. Like he meant nothing. Jamal felt something inside him snap. A hot, stinging burn filled his throat, his chest. The room was spinning. Miss S. Thompson turned back to the board and, in big, bold red letters, wrote F next to his answer. Her voice was calm when she spoke. "I don't tolerate dishonesty in my classroom." Silence. Jamal couldn't move, couldn't think. Behind him, students whispered, chuckled, shook their heads. Someone muttered, "Knew it was too good to be true." Jamal stared at the torn paper in her hands. He had solved the problem, and still lost, still failed, because no matter how smart he was, He wasn't supposed to win. Jamal stood frozen in front of the class, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The shredded remains of his perfect test dangled from Mrs. Thompson's fingers like crumpled trash. The red F on the board felt like a brand, burning into his skin. He had done everything right. He had taken the risk. He had shown them who he really was. And still, it wasn't enough. A few students whispered, their voices cutting through the suffocating silence. Damn, she really did him like that. See? Told you. No way he's that smart. Man, I almost thought he was a genius for a second. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, but sharp enough to slice right through him. Jamal felt his throat tighten. A familiar lump formed, one he had swallowed down too many times before. This was the part where he was supposed to stay quiet, to shrink, to let it go. But something inside him, something tired, raw, and fed up, refused to. He clenched his fists and stepped forward. I didn't cheat. The laughter stopped. Miss S. Thompson turned to him slowly, as if surprised he was still speaking. Excuse me? She said, arching a brow. Jamal's voice was steady now. Stronger. I didn't cheat. For a second, the class didn't make a sound. Then Mrs. Thompson sighed, shaking her head as if he were some misbehaving child who just wouldn't quit. Then explain it, she said, gesturing to the board. Jamal already had, but he knew what she wanted. She didn't want logic. She didn't want proof. She wanted submission. I don't need to explain it, Jamal said. His own voice startled him. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't apologetic. It was defiant. Ms. S. Thompson's expression darkened. Watch your tone, Carter. Jamal exhaled sharply through his nose, his hands trembling at his sides. He was watching his tone. He had spent his whole life watching his tone. Never too loud, never too angry, never too much. And still, no matter how careful he was, no matter how much he held back, people like her would always find a reason to doubt him, to belittle him, to remind him that kids like him weren't supposed to be brilliant. And he was done. He turned to the class, his eyes locking onto the faces of the kids who had laughed, the ones who had whispered behind his back. Why is it so hard for you to believe that I solved it? A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked, unimpressed. One boy near the front, Ethan Reynolds, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Because guys like you don't do that kind of stuff, he said matter-of-factly. The words hit Jamal harder than he expected. Not because they surprised him, but because they didn't. He had spent years pretending comments like that didn't matter, that they didn't bother him. But in this moment, standing at the front of the class with every eye on him, he felt it. Every time he had been dismissed, every time he had been underestimated, every time someone had decided who he was before he even had the chance to show them. Mrs. Thompson sighed again, louder this time, as if she was done indulging a child's tantrum. Sit down, Carter, she said, her voice colder now. I won't argue with you. Jamal didn't move. Mrs. Thompson's jaw tightened. Now, a muscle in Jamal's cheek twitched. He could feel it, the eyes, the expectations. They were waiting for him to obey, to fold. And that's what he should have done, because arguing would only make things worse. Because challenging someone like her, someone with power, never ended well for kids like him. But Jamal was tired. So instead of backing down, instead of lowering his head and accepting his fate, he took the marker, walked up to the F on the board, and wiped it off. The classroom erupted. Oh, shh. Ain't no way! He just did that? Mrs. Thompson's face went pale. For the first time since this started, she looked truly stunned. Jamal turned to face her, his chest rising and falling. His heart was slamming against his ribs, but his voice was steady. I earned my grade, he said. And you know it. More whispers. Some kids looked nervous. Others looked impressed. Miss S. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. Her next words came out slow, controlled but sharp as a blade. Principal's office. Now. The murmurs died instantly. Jamal's stomach dropped, but he didn't flinch. He expected this. He had pushed back, and now he was going to pay for it. Still, he stood tall. His eyes locked onto Miss S. Thompson's. And before he turned to leave, he said just 3 words, "You're wrong." Then he walked out the door. And this time, no one laughed. The hallway outside room 3002 felt eerily quiet as Jamal walked, his heart pounding against his ribs. The laughter, the whispers, the judgment, it was all still buzzing in his ears, but the moment he stepped outside the classroom, it was replaced by something else, a deafening silence. He knew where this was going. Principal's office, a lecture, a warning, maybe even a suspension. For what? Erasing a grade he didn't deserve? Refusing to be silent? His hands clenched into fists as he turned the corner toward the administrative office. But before he could take another step, Jamal, the voice came out of nowhere, sharp, urgent. He barely had time to register what was happening before Dre, his best friend, his brother in everything but blood, came barreling toward him. Breathless, wide-eyed, frantic. "Yo, you gotta come now. It's your mom." Jamal stopped cold. His mom? His stomach twisted. Dre grabbed his arm, his grip tight, too tight. "They took her, man." Jamal's breath hitched. "Who?" But he already knew. And then, before Dre could answer, a voice from behind made his whole body go rigid. Jamal Carter stopped right there. He turned slowly. Officer Bennett, a cop, inside the school. For him, Jamal's blood ran cold. Bennett was tall, broad, white. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His expression? A mixture of boredom and something colder. Something Jamal recognized. He had seen it before. Too many times. Dre stepped in front of him instinctively. "What's this about?" Dre's voice was steady, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Bennett didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Jamal. "Your mother's been detained," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. "And we need to have a conversation." Jamal's stomach twisted so hard he thought he might be sick. Detained? No, that didn't make sense. His mom was probably at work right now, scrubbing floors, cleaning up after people who never even bothered to learn her name. His mom who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. His mom who never did anything wrong. His pulse roared in his ears. "What are you talking about?" His voice came out raw, shaky. Bennett exhaled, looking almost annoyed that he had to explain himself. "There was a robbery at Miller's convenience store this morning." Jamal's brain stalled. Miller's? That was barely 3 blocks from their apartment. "She didn't do anything," he said immediately, his voice firm, certain, because there was no way this was real. Bennett's face remained blank. The store owner made a report. A woman matching her description was seen in the area shortly before it happened. Matching her description. That was it? That was all they needed? A vague description? A guess? A black woman near a crime scene. And suddenly, she was a suspect? Dre took a step closer. "This is bullshit." Bennett finally looked at him then, his eyes flashing. "Watch your mouth, kid." Dre glared back, his jaw tight. But he didn't say anything else. Because they both knew. Talking back to a cop? That was a whole different game. Jamal felt something heavy pressing down on his chest, something dark and suffocating. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. "Where is she?" His voice barely came out. Bennett glanced down at his watch. Downtown precinct. Jamal took a step forward, but Bennett's hand shot up. "You're staying here." Jamal's breath stuttered. "She's my mom, and you're a minor. You're not going anywhere." Something inside Jamal cracked. Everything that had happened today, Miss S. Thompson, the humiliation, the whispers, the way his classmates had looked at him like he was something to be laughed at, none of it compared to this. None of it. Dre's hand found his shoulder, gripping it tight. A silent message. Stay calm. Don't do something stupid. But Jamal wasn't sure he could. Not when his mother, the strongest person he knew, the woman who worked herself to exhaustion just so he could have a future, was sitting in some police station because someone had thought she looked like a suspect. His fists clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. "I need to see her." Bennett's gaze was cold. "That's not your call to make." The word slammed into Jamal like a fist. It didn't matter what he wanted. Didn't matter what was true. Didn't matter that his mother had never so much as stolen a pack of gum in her life. The system didn't care. The people in power didn't care. A sharp ringing filled his ears. Everything felt too loud and too quiet all at once. He had thought Miss S. Thompson's actions had been unfair. He had thought getting accused of cheating was the worst thing that could happen today. But this? This was something else. This wasn't just unfair. This was wrong. His eyes locked onto Bennett's. "You're making a mistake." Bennett didn't blink. "Funny. Your teacher said the same thing about you." Jamal's breath caught. The room spun. Mrs. Thompson. She had told them. She had set this up. She had known about his mom, had called someone, had made a report, had done something to make sure today was more than just about a failing grade. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a reminder. No matter how smart he was, no matter how hard his mother worked, they would always see them as less. Bennett's radio crackled. He reached for it, glancing away for half a second. It was enough. Jamal turned and ran. Jamal ran. His legs moved before his brain could catch up, before logic could tell him that running wouldn't change a damn thing. But he didn't care. He couldn't just stand there while his mom sat in a holding cell, treated like a criminal for nothing. The halls of Riverside Middle blurred as he tore past lockers and classrooms, his sneakers pounding against the linoleum floor. Voices shouted behind him, Bennett's, Dre's, maybe even Miss S. Thompson's, but he didn't stop. He shoved open the double doors at the end of the hallway, bursting into the late morning sun. The crisp autumn air hit his face, sharp and cold. His lungs burned. Where was he even going? He had no plan, no way to fix this. But he knew one thing. He had to see his mom. He didn't get far. The moment he hit the sidewalk, a second cop stepped out from a patrol car parked by the curb. "Hey, stop right there." Jamal skidded to a halt, his heart slamming against his ribs. This officer was younger than Bennett, but had the same tired, indifferent look in his eyes, like Jamal was just another box to check off in his shift. Jamal's hands curled into fists. He could run again, but then what? This wasn't a game of tag. He wasn't some kid skipping class. He was a black boy running from a cop. And kids like him? They didn't get second chances. Slowly, he raised his hands. Not because he was guilty, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had no choice. By the time they marched him back into the building, Miss S. Thompson was waiting. Her arms were crossed, her expression a mask of forced concern. "What in the world is going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp, performative. She wasn't asking because she cared. She was asking because she wanted to be seen asking. Jamal swallowed the anger rising in his throat. Bennett stepped beside him, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. This one tried to run. Miss S. Thompson sexed under her breath. Carter, what are we going to do with you?" Jamal snapped his head up. What did she just say? She made it sound like this was his fault. Like this was some behavioral issue, like he was a problem to be solved. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "My mother is innocent." His voice was low but steady. "And you know it, Miss S." Thompson tilted her head. Now, let's not get emotional. Not get emotional." His hands shook. She was gaslighting him, right here, in front of everyone, like he was the one making a scene, like he was the one overreacting. The cop, the teacher, the school, they were all part of the same system, moving in sync, trained to break people like him down until they didn't fight back. And he hated that it was working. Dre appeared at the end of the hall, breathless from chasing after them. He shoved past the cop and stepped between Jamal and Miss S. Thompson. "So this is how it is, huh?" Dre's voice was sharp, unflinching. "Kid does something y'all don't expect, and now suddenly he's a criminal?" Mrs. Thompson's face twisted into something unreadable. Bennett let out a small sigh. "No one said that." "You didn't have to," Dre shot back. "We already know the script." Jamal swallowed hard. He didn't realize how badly he needed someone to say it out loud until Dre did. Because it was true. They already knew how this story was supposed to go. Jamal would be suspended, blacklisted, put in remedial classes. His mother would be booked, processed, and, if she was lucky, released with no job to return to. Because this wasn't about fairness. It was about control, and they were supposed to stay in their place. Miss S. Thompson folded her arms, her lips pursed. "That's enough." Her voice was clipped now, the fake concern gone. Jamal could see it in her eyes the moment she decided that she was done with him. Done pretending, done hiding. She straightened her blazer and turned to Bennett. "We don't tolerate disruption in this school," she said smoothly. "And clearly, Carter is struggling with authority. Authority." Jamal's fingers twitched. What authority? The kind that humiliated him? That erased his achievements? That tore his mother away from him for nothing? Bennett nodded. We'll take it from here. Take it from here. A new kind of fear jolted through him. Did they mean him or his mother? Was this just step one? Would they come for him next? He opened his mouth to argue, to fight, to scream. But before he could, a voice cut through the hallway. Excuse me, what exactly is happening here? They all turned. Mrs. Carter. His mother stood at the entrance, flanked by another officer, a black woman, this time her presence starkly different from the others. Her uniform was still powerful, intimidating, but her expression? That was different. That was human. She looked at Bennett. Let him go. Bennett hesitated. Ma'am, we were under the impression that you were under the wrong impression. She handed him a stack of papers. Jamal watched as Bennett flipped through them, his brows pulling together. After a long, tense pause, he sighed. And then just like that, he let go. The moment his grip lifted from Jamal's shoulder, Jamal exhaled shakily, like he could breathe for the first time all day. The silence stretched. No one knew what to say. Mrs. Carter looked at her son, her eyes softening. Let's go home, baby. Jamal nodded. But before he turned away, before he walked out those doors, he looked at Mrs. Thompson. And for the first time, she didn't look powerful. She just looked small. Jamal's chest rose and fell. She wasn't the one who won today, and she knew it. The ride home was silent. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, watching the city blur past him in streaks of gray and gold. His mother gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale, the only visible sign of how close they had come to disaster. She hadn't spoken since they left the school. She didn't need to. Jamal could feel her anger in the way she exhaled too slowly, in the way her fingers tapped against the leather steering wheel, in the way she blinked too often, like she was trying to hold back something too big, too painful, too exhausting. He swallowed hard. She had just spent hours sitting in a holding cell for no reason. She had been treated like a criminal, forced to defend herself against accusations that weren't just wrong, they were never even about her. She had been a pawn, just like him. When they pulled into their apartment complex, Jamal hesitated before getting out of the car. Mama. Not now, Jamal. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it wasn't soft either. She was tired, and for once, Jamal didn't push. He got out, letting the door close behind him as she stayed inside, staring at the dashboard, lost in thought. The weight of the day pressed against his shoulders as he climbed the stairs to their apartment. The hallway smelled like fried food from a neighbor's kitchen, mixed with the faint scent of old paint and dust. The same smells he had known his whole life, the smells of home. Only tonight, it didn't feel like home. Inside, he tossed his backpack onto the couch and walked straight to his room, closing the door behind him. The second he sat on his bed, everything came crashing down. The anger, the humiliation, the fear. He ran a hand down his face, breathing hard. This morning, he had been nobody, invisible. A kid who kept his head down, who didn't make waves, who solved equations in the margins of his notebook just to feel like he mattered, even if no one else ever saw it. Now he was the problem. The kid who talked back, the kid who ran, the kid whose mother got arrested because someone decided she looked like a suspect. Jamal clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. This was bigger than a math test, bigger than Mrs. Thompson, bigger than a grade. This was his life. And now, he had a choice. He could shrink. He could go back to staying quiet, to taking whatever they threw at him, to pretending that if he just kept his head down long enough, things would get better, or he could fight. A knock on the door made him look up. Dre. Jamal didn't say anything, but Dre stepped inside anyway, dropping onto the bed across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, "You good?" Dre finally asked. Jamal let out a hollow laugh. "You really think I'm good?" Dre sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Nah. But I figured I'd ask." Jamal shook his head, staring at the floor. "I don't know what to do, man." His voice was quiet. "Feels like no matter what I do, it don't matter. They'll always see me the same way." Dre was silent for a long time. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the bed beside Jamal. Jamal frowned, picking it up. When he unfolded it, his chest tightened. It was his test. The one Mrs. Thompson had torn in half. Taped back together, Jamal stared at it, his throat burning. Where did you? Grabbed it from the trash before I followed you out, Dre said casually. Like it wasn't a big deal. Like it didn't mean the world to Jamal. Jamal ran his fingers over the torn edges, over the red 100% circled at the top. For a second, his vision blurred. This wasn't just a test. This was proof. Proof that he was more than what they saw. Proof that he deserved to be in that class, in that school, in any room he walked into. Proof that no matter how hard they tried to erase him, he was still here. Jamal exhaled slowly. Then he grabbed his notebook, and he started writing. Dre watched, his brows pulling together. What are you doing? Jamal didn't stop. His pencil flew across the page, faster than it ever had before. Numbers, words, ideas, they spilled out of him like something unstoppable. Dre leaned closer. Jamal's handwriting was messy, rushed. But the message was clear. The truth is, they don't want us to be smart. They don't want us to be strong. They want us to be quiet. But we don't have to be. Dre let out a low whistle. Damn. Jamal nodded, flipping the page, already writing more. Dre smirked. You thinking what I'm thinking? Jamal met his eyes. And for the first time since this nightmare started, he smiled. Tomorrow, they would go back to school. Tomorrow, they would walk into that classroom. And tomorrow, they wouldn't be silent. The next morning, Jamal stood outside Riverside Middle School, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his heartbeat steady and strong. Dre stood beside him, arms crossed, his usual smirk in place. But there was something different in his eyes, something sharper, more determined. Today was different. Today, they weren't just walking into school. They were walking into battle. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the usual morning noise, lockers slamming, students laughing, sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. But the moment Jamal and Dre stepped in, the energy shifted. People noticed them. Whispers started. Yo, he's back? Ain't no way. Man, after what happened yesterday, he should have transferred. Some kids looked at Jamal with curiosity, others with pity. A few still looked at him like he didn't belong. But Jamal? He kept walking, because today he wasn't here for them. They pushed through the crowd, making their way toward room 3002, math class, Miss S. Thompson, the place where everything had started. As soon as they stepped inside, the whispers died. Miss S. Thompson was already there, standing at the whiteboard, flipping through a lesson plan. When she saw Jamal, her brows lifted ever so slightly, not in surprise, but in something colder, disappointment, as if she had expected him to stay gone, as if she had hoped for it. Jamal walked past her, straight to his desk. He set his notebook down, his fingers brushing over the cover. His test was still folded inside, taped back together, a reminder, a promise. Class began like normal. Miss S. Thompson droning on, reviewing last night's assignment. Jamal waited, and then he raised his hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Because Jamal never raised his hand. Because for months, he had let himself fade into the background, had let people assume he was just another quiet kid who didn't care. But today, he wanted to be seen. Miss S. Thompson's eyes locked onto his. Yes, Carter? Jamal took a breath. I have a question. His voice was loud, clear. The class turned to look at him, some exchanging glances, others leaning forward. Mrs. Thompson sighed, placing her marker down. Go on. Jamal reached into his notebook, pulled out his test, the one she had torn apart. He held it up. You said I didn't deserve this grade. His voice didn't shake. So I want you to explain why. The class went silent. Miss S. Thompson's expression didn't change. But Jamal saw it. The flicker of irritation, the tightening of her jaw. She clasped her hands in front of her. We're moving on from that discussion, Carter. Jamal nodded. I'm not. Dre let out a low whistle under his breath, a grin spreading across his face. Miss S. Thompson exhaled sharply. This is not the time for… No, this is exactly the time, Jamal interrupted. Because you tried to erase me. And I'm still here. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Some students gasped. Others stared at him in disbelief. Because no one spoke to Mrs. Thompson like that. But Jamal wasn't done. How many kids like me have you done this to? He asked, his voice steady. How many times have you made someone feel like they weren't good enough? Like they didn't belong? Miss S. Thompson's face hardened. That's enough. But Jamal just shook his head. Nah. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. But it carried weight. I deserve to be here. And then he turned to the class. So do all of you. A few students shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down, but others looked at him with something new, recognition. Because they had felt it too, the doubt, the silence, the weight of being told they weren't enough. They had just never said it out loud, until now. Mrs. Thompson's expression was unreadable, but Jamal could feel the tension rolling off her in waves. She wasn't used to this. She was used to control. And now, she had lost it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Thompson turned back to the whiteboard. Open your textbooks, she said, her voice clipped. Page 147. And just like that, the moment passed. Jamal sat back in his seat, heart still racing. He knew nothing had changed. Not really. Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to admit what she did. The system wasn't going to magically fix itself overnight. But that wasn't the point. Because for the first time, he hadn't let them take his voice. For the first time, he had spoken. And somewhere, in that silence that had stretched between him and his classmates, he knew someone had heard him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now. Later that night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, flipping through his notebook, pencil tapping against the paper. His mother sat across from him, watching him closely. Finally, she spoke. "You sure you're ready for this, baby?" Jamal exhaled, meeting her eyes. "I have to be." His mother smiled small, tired, but proud. "Then fight, Jamal." She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "But don't let the fight take you away from who you are." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He was never going to be silent again. This isn't just one boy's story. It's the story of every person who's ever been underestimated, silenced, or told they didn't belong. But here's the truth, your voice matters. And when you use it, you change the game. Have you ever witnessed injustice like this? Or worse, have you lived it? Drop your story in the comments, because the more we share, the harder it is to ignore. If this made you think, share it. If this made you feel like it. And if this made you angry, subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Justice doesn't happen in silence, so let's make some noise.